Chapter 1381, Authority. Inside the White Tower, the headquarters of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. After Luca Brewster, who was trapped underground, completed his prayer, he focused his attention back on the seal autonomously strengthening itself. He wanted to find out exactly what was going on, to see if he could decipher the secrets hidden within and use them to invent some mystical techniques. As he proceeded down each level, checking each and every sealed artifact, Luca was taken aback and stopped in his tracks. His expression became rather confused. He was lost on whether to take his next step with his left foot or right foot. This seemed to be a very profound, esoteric question to comprehend. In the southern continent, beside a cathedral belonging to the Evernight goddess, Leonard picked up the cup of coffee made from local ground beans and wanted to take a sip. During this process, his thoughts wandered to the closed windows and the bright sky, trying to figure out the anomaly. However, he was unable to leave the room and was sealed here. As for old man Palez Zoroast, he had fallen into a strange state of silence without answering his questions. Thankfully, there wasn't any additional danger. Therefore, Leonard could still sit in peace, using thoughts to replace action. After an unknown period of time, he looked down at the cup of coffee that had been placed back on the table. He frowned slightly and muttered to himself in puzzlement.
What did I want to do just now?
The Rorstad Archipelago, in the concealed Biome City. Having not noticed the changes in the environment, Danitz carefully fiddled with the telegraph device in his room. The Golden Dream had recently come to the Sonia Sea and stopped at a port with the telegraph office. Danitz wanted to invite them over to Biome as guests to take in the grandeur of a Lord's Oracle. If possible, he wished that the Golden Dream could use Biome as its primary harbor. This way, he could return to the ship at any time to participate in adventures and seek out treasures. At the same time, he could choose to listen to the captain's lectures. As an all-rounder, Danitz had no doubt mastered all the knowledge and techniques needed to send a telegram. At that moment, he sat in front of the machine and quickly tapped his fingers, sending out the words he had constructed. At the very beginning, his thoughts were clear and his words were proper. This left him somewhat smug. Gradually, his eyes stared straight, and his hands didn't stop moving, as if he was doing it on instinct. After the telegram was sent out, Danitz exhaled, picked up a cup, and gulped down a mouthful of beer. Danitz thought proudly and worriedly.
It was quicker than I expected. Even if I lose my job in the future, I can still go to the telegraph office to get a job with a good salary.
He casually picked up the telegram draft and recalled the process of how he sent it out. His expression gradually turned odd. Danitz couldn't help but whisper.
What did I send in the end?
Apparently, he had very likely mocked the first mate, second mate, iron skin, and barrel towards the latter half of the telegram. Then, he passionately confessed to the captain.
I'm finished. Why would I express what's hidden in my heart?
Danitz's face turned pale as he suspected that he had been controlled by the potion. The content he had written didn't actually go through his head. He hurriedly sent a telegram to indicate that the content from before had nothing to do with him. It was all a result of Anderson deliberately causing trouble. At this moment, he realized that something was amiss outside. The sky was gray, and there wasn't a single cloud. In the astral world, the existences and objects that had been concealed by the Evernight goddess broke through the restrictions and returned to reality one after another. They were like Amon's actual body, looking somewhat dazed without making any immediate reaction. In addition, the Evernight goddess also paused in midair in confusion, as though she hadn't thought about her subsequent actions. However, her first instinct was to protect herself. The Lord of Storms, the eternal blazing sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, who had been restricted by the thick prism-like spots of light in their own kingdoms, also experienced certain changes. The intensity of their counterattacks was clearly lower, giving people a sense of self-doubt, unsure if the entity before them was an enemy. The genie abandoned the Trunsois brass book and directly returned to the magic wishing lamp. He seemed to have fought to his limits and had no choice but to retreat into the seal. He also seemed to recall something as he subconsciously evaded. Antigonus, who had just regained his self-awareness and lucidity, was once again confused. His face was filled with question marks.
Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing? What is happening around me?
In the forsaken land of the gods, the ancient sun god's giant shadow sighed and said,
"Let there be light."
The light in the astral world brightened as it stabbed into the eyes of Amon's true body, avatars, primordial demoness, hidden sage, and other existences. They immediately regained their senses and made use of the time to respond differently. The flood of information suddenly dispersed and fused with the various symbols around it, instantly disappearing. The black python-like tentacles with an eyeball on their ends retracted rapidly. No one knew where they went. Amon's true body looked at Klein, who had just advanced, and gave up the chance to exert his influence while his condition was unstable. He raised his hand and adjusted the crystal monocle on his right eye. His figure split into multiple, seemingly illusory and realistic doors. The doors opened and closed at the same time, preventing any existences like the Evernight goddess from knowing where Amon's true body had gone to. After Amon's true body left, his avatars faded and disappeared in a bizarre manner. This was using a loophole, turning the act of Amon's true body leaving to being equivalent to Amon's leaving. At the same time, the giant shadow that the ancient sun god had expanded only to shrink and transform back into Adam, who carried a thick shadow on his back. Beneath the feet of this visionary, the sea that contained all colors instantly dissipated as though it had returned underground. Looking up at the astral world, Adam returned to the back of that shadow screen through a crack. The fusion between him and the true creator had just begun, and it wasn't over yet. The attempt to raise himself to the level of half a great old one was actually rather difficult and risky. This would make their progress a lot slower in the future. In the astral world, as the war subsided, the natural barrier formed by plants and the portraits of civilization faded away, along with the illusory crimson moon. The Lord of Storms, eternal blazing sun, and the God of knowledge and wisdom first shattered the thick spots of light outside their divine kingdoms. Then they calmed down and returned to continue blocking the world barrier's cracks. The Evernight goddess, who was floating above the ancient palace, put away the pitch-black coffin, the twilight sword, the bird-shaped golden accessory, and her 4 arms. She cast her gaze downwards. After the translucent, dark-colored cloak produced the mask, it transformed into Klein's body. Klein pressed one hand against the almost invisible mask on his face, and he placed the other at his abdomen. His back was slightly arched, as though he was suffering indescribable pain. Just as he raised his head and looked at the Evernight goddess's face that was covered with a thin black veil, a pitch-black cloak appeared outside his body. Slippery and sinister tentacles extended from beneath the cloak. After becoming the fool, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in him had undoubtedly awakened further. The crazy ravings and roars continued to echo in Klein's ears, tearing through his mind, letting him know that this was going to be his future. There was no way to kill the Lord of the Mysteries. Even if his will was slowly worn down by time, his consciousness would remain forever. He could snatch Klein's body at any moment and completely revive. If it wasn't for the fact that he had just killed the Lord of the Mysteries' will, making the awakening him weaker than what Klein expected, Klein suspected that he might not be able to survive. All he could do was watch as his body collapsed, and he became another existence. Of course, he could still seek the Evernight goddess's help to give him a drop of the river of eternal darkness's river water. However, this wasn't a long-term solution. He could only delay it for some time before ultimately facing it. Relying on his own consciousness and anchors, Klein stabilized the consciousness of the celestial worthy in him. At this moment, he was unable to speak. The Evernight goddess above nodded gently and said,
"What you need now is stability."
With that said, her figure was wiped inch by inch as she returned to the divine kingdom in the astral world. Klein turned his head to look at the slightly dazed Antigonus. With a thought, he returned to Sapphira Castle. Sitting in the half-collapsed palace, Antigonus sat on a huge stone chair. He felt as though he had just been through a very, very long dream. Inside Sapphira Castle, Klein sat at the fool's seat and focused on stabilizing his mental state. Just like before he achieved an initial level of stability, he had no way of seeking treatment from a psychiatrist. Unless he paid a visit to Adam, it was very likely that he would go even crazier. With some stability, Klein quickly checked the authorities he obtained. It was called fooling. Not only did it contain history, time, fate, change, and concealment, but it also included the mind domains of blind stupidity. The simplest application was to lower an enemy's intelligence. Just as Klein was about to research them further, his spiritual perception was triggered. Someone had invaded Sapphira Castle, and only when the enemy successfully invaded did Klein obtain a notification. Klein suddenly looked up and saw that the grayish-white fog had formed a door at the other end of the long mottled table. A figure wearing a pointed hat, a classic black robe, and a monocle walked out. "Amen!" There was a tinge of darkness in Mr. Error's eyes, as his smile appeared somewhat crazy. He leisurely looked around and nudged his monocle. He said with a smile,
Are you pleasantly surprised?
Klein wanted to use Sapphira Castle to expel him, but he realized that at some point in time, Eamon had gained control over Sapphira Castle. Eamon cast his gaze at him, pulled out a chair, and sat down, chuckling.
I released the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries in my body. Him being the owner of Sapphira Castle makes me equivalent to being the owner of Sapphira Castle. Of course I can enter. This is very risky. Even in the past, I didn't dare to try it before, but since you've grown to this extent, I can only take the risk. This is very exciting. I'm quite pleased with the effects.
As Eamon spoke, slippery and sinister tentacles appeared beneath his clothes. He took the initiative to revive part of the Lord of the Mysteries, allowing himself to enter a half-crazy state. Chapter 1382, Home Ground Advantage. As Eamon spoke, Klein appeared to be listening, but he had actually attempted to leave Sapphira Castle. This wasn't because he wanted to give up or surrender, nor was it because he was too timid and subconsciously considered fleeing first. Instead, he believed that this was the best solution for the current situation. If he stayed in Sapphira Castle, Klein would face 3 difficult questions. Firstly, he had just advanced to the Fool, and his condition was extremely unstable. He had to divert a large portion of his mental strength to suppress the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Secondly, there was no way for him to obtain the help of his allies. He could only fight alone. Thirdly, under the situation that everyone could influence Sapphira Castle, even if Klein had a deeper level of control over Sapphira Castle, he wouldn't be able to express an overwhelming advantage. He might even be disrupted in his use of Sapphira Castle because his opponent was good at making use of loopholes and creating bugs, making it difficult for him to reach the same level as him. This way, when a Sequence 0 the Fool faced a half-crazed dual-pathway error and door, even if he wasn't in a scenario of facing a 100% failure rate, the chances of winning were extremely minute, and by taking the opportunity to escape Sapphira Castle, Klein could immediately obtain the help of his allies to reverse the situation between the two. If Eamon were to chase after him, Klein would interfere with his return to Setaimo Castle and make him face his allies. At that time, the primordial demoness would definitely not attack again. The ancient sun god might not be able to reproduce the power of half a great old one anytime soon. With the lead of the Evernight goddess, the 6 orthodox deities were enough to deal with Eamon. Even if Eamon, who was in control of all the authorities of the error and door domains, wasn't easily killed, the orthodox deities would definitely be able to weaken him and seal him. After Klein stabilized his mental state and deepened his control over Sapphira Castle, he could then kill him in a targeted manner. This process was almost irreversible. Even if the ancient sun god could still produce the level, status, and strength from before, his limit appeared to be suppressing 3 orthodox deities at the same time, and this didn't include the Evernight goddess. Of course, the outer deities were undoubtedly unwilling to see the birth of a new Lord of the Mysteries. Once such a situation happened, they would definitely try their best to interfere, preventing Aman from dying. However, before the world barrier collapsed, the influence they could exert would be rather limited, and it might not be of much use. Just like before, Klein believed that the combined powers of the dark side of the universe and the chained god were inferior to the hidden sage. Even if the outer deities managed to affect the situation, Klein wouldn't suffer any losses. After all, those existences wouldn't allow Aemon to kill him either. He could find a place to hide and stabilize his mental state. Once he was prepared, he could make new plans again. The foggy town of the Evernight Goddess was a very good choice. If Aemon didn't chase after him and remained inside Sapphira Castle, Klein could use his identity as the owner of Sapphira Castle to influence the control of all kinds of matters within at any moment, preventing Aemon from doing anything in Sapphira Castle. Even if he wanted to use the Crimson Star to deal with the Tarot Club members, it would be impossible. In short, it would be extremely difficult for either of them to use Sapphira Castle well, but destroying the other party's attempts was definitely simple. Under such a stalemate, Klein had time to stabilize his mental state, deepening his control over Sapphira Castle, slowly turning the situation around. Towards the end, Aemon would either flee and hide, or he would let the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings completely revive, choosing to have an internecine outcome with Klein. Therefore, although he didn't have the time to analyze the pros and cons, Klein quickly came to a conclusion. Leaving Sapphira Castle now was the best choice. However, just as his consciousness sank to the edge of Sapphira Castle, he saw a crystal monocle. This item appeared in time, crushing Klein's hopes of escaping. Aemon curled his index finger and pressed it against the monocle as he smiled.
Did you think I'd leave such an obvious loophole? Of course, you can stop me from leaving Sapphira Castle at any time.
Behind the chair that he was sitting on, the resplendent symbol rapidly changed. At times it was formed from symbols corresponding to parasitizing, time, and fate. At times it was a series of doors. These two different symbols appeared one after another, making it impossible to truly be fixed. Klein didn't hear what Aemon said. The moment he failed, he created a real realm of mysteries, a complete divine kingdom of the fool. Light and shadows instantly changed in front of Aemon's eyes. It brought with it the disappearance of the grand palace, modeled table, and luxurious high-backed chair, bringing with it an ancient castle. Aemon wasn't sure what the ancient castle looked like. This was because he was standing in a corridor inside the castle. He could only sense the various changes in Sapphira Castle and see with the limited vision he had. The corridor was unusually dark and gloomy. The corridor stretched endlessly. There were silver-colored, elegant candle stands spaced widely apart, each producing a dim and yellow glow. There were dark red wooden doors on both sides of the corridor that seemed to connect to different rooms. There was no sound from the rooms, making it virtually impossible to know what was hidden inside. Aemon casually glanced at it and smiled with interest.
Interesting.
As the most powerful cryptologist, he naturally knew that this was a divine kingdom, one that couldn't be broken through with brute force. This was because every door was reassembled with different items. If he forcefully broke through them, he would trigger unknown effects. Aemon didn't underestimate the abilities and intelligence of a Sequence Zero the Fool. He didn't plan on experiencing any more surprises or accidents. However, once the Divine Kingdom's rules were fixed, its owner would similarly be restricted to a certain extent. To put it simply, Klein was definitely in one of the rooms, not somewhere else. One had to bear the corresponding responsibility for the benefits obtained. Aemon whispered as though he was talking to an invisible person.
You want to use this method to stall for time and stabilize your mental state?
Then, wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, he walked to the nearest dark red wooden door. There were no holes on the wooden door, so he couldn't see the exact situation inside. In other words, it was very difficult for Aemon to know if Klein was here without opening the door. Lu doch, go doch. The go. The corners of Aemon's mouth curled up slightly. Aemon extended his right hand and drew a long rectangular shape on the dark red wooden door. Inside the rectangle, bits of starlight emerged and turned transparent, revealing the scene in the room. With the authority of door and the ability of bug, Eamon forcibly opened a window without triggering the effects. Following that, he cast his gaze into the room. There were no tables, chairs, carpets, and other furniture, but a blue sea. Machaler ha, Eamon said without any surprise.
Indeed, this door has been connected with the sea outside.
Once he twisted the door, he would leave Sapphira Castle and appear in the sea outside. And at that time, with Klein being wary, it was almost impossible for him to enter Sapphira Castle again, just like how Klein was unable to leave Sapphira Castle. This was the reason why Eamon didn't forcibly destroy the Fool's divine kingdom, but opened one door at a time. Destruction led to similar effects. The repeated effects would affect Eamon again and again. Even if there were many loopholes that he could use, he wouldn't be completely immune to them. Retracting his gaze, Eamon walked to the opposite room and opened a window according to the method from before. However, this time it was pitch black inside, and he couldn't see anything. Eamon raised his hand and pinched the edge of his monocle and coughed lightly. His figure instantly split into two. The number of Eamons increased. The split Eamon glanced at Eamon, who stood in the same spot, and TSKED.
Why aren't you seeking the thrill yourself?
As he spoke, this Eamon extended his right palm and grabbed the handle of the dark red wooden door. Just as he began twisting, his expression suddenly turned blank as he sat down, as though he had lost the ability to think. The original Eamon nodded slightly.
Fooling effect.
The retarded Amon immediately collapsed and turned into a transparent worm with 12 segments. Tiny bits of Beyonder characteristics seeped out and returned to Eamon's body. He relied on using the loophole to avoid the negative effects of his avatars from acting on his actual body. After all the Beyonder characteristics returned, Eamon released a flame that had been stolen and burned the corpse of the Worm of Time. After doing this leisurely, he looked up and adjusted the monocle on his right eye. On the crystal monocle, countless symbols, patterns, and labels appeared. They moved quickly, interweaving, reforming, or changing, as though they were making calculations. This was a combination of a cryptologist's power of decryption and the Key of Stars' authority on position. The two attempts Eamon made were mainly to gather intelligence, grasp the rules, and prepare for cracking the secrets of the Fool's divine kingdom. Soon, the symbols, patterns, and labels formed a scene on the monocle. Behind a dark red wooden door, a few slippery tentacles extended out from Klein's body. He sat on a high-backed chair and calmly watched the entrance. The corners of Eamon's mouth curled up. With a flash, he appeared in the room. However, everything before his eyes suddenly collapsed. Klein, with the Fool's aura, quickly turned thin, turning into a card. On the card, Roselle Gustave was wearing a gorgeous head accessory and colorful clothes, holding a stick with luggage hanging from it. His eyes were filled with longing. The Fool card. The Fool card from the Cards of Blasphemy. Klein knew that relying solely on paper figurine substitutes and adding the fooling effect and grafting his true aura onto it wouldn't be able to deceive a top-notch swindler like Eamon. Therefore, he used the Fool card, which had some convergence powers, as his paper figurine. Although Sapphira Castle couldn't be used again, this was Klein's home ground after all. There was his junk pile, the various items he had gathered, and the newly obtained Trunsoist brass book and the borrowed magic wishing lamp. Chapter 1383, Stipulated Rules. With the Klein in front of Eamon turning into the Fool card, the room shrank and revealed its original appearance. It was an iron cigar case that had marks of being corroded slightly. It had fused with the aura of Sapphira Castle. Klein's figure appeared out of nowhere as the entire divine kingdom of the Fool collapsed. As the magnificent palace reappeared, he grabbed the vessel that carried the Fool card and Eamon's true body and suddenly closed it. He didn't have hopes of using this item to seal Eamon, who wielded the corresponding authority of the door pathway. All he wanted was to buy some time and find a chance to throw Amon out of Sapphira Castle and retrieve the initiative. But at that moment, Klein, who was wearing a black trench coat, paused. His other hand took out a crystal monocle from the void with his other hand and placed it in his right eye. Behind him, Aman, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, quickly outlined his figure. His eyes were dark and wild as he laughed.
What made you think that I didn't use an avatar?
Before he finished his sentence, Klein's figure that had been parasitized rapidly turned thin, turning into a crude paper figurine. Klein was cautious and hadn't used his true form either. He relied on a paper figurine substitute that had spirit-body threads grafted. He knew very well that he would rather give up an opportunity than make mistakes when fighting Amon. Once he made a mistake, under the suppression effect of a bug, it would be very difficult for him to turn the tables. With regards to the situation of the prey turning into a paper figurine, Amon didn't seem to be surprised. All he did was raise his hand to touch the crystal monocle. At the other end of the Grand Palace, Klein, who was wearing a top hat and a trench coat, uncontrollably walked out of the fool's automatic concealment. He raised his right hand and took out a crystal monocle from the void with great difficulty, slowly moving it towards his right eye. During this process, Klein's expression was filled with resistance and rather warped, as though he couldn't control his hand. The half-crazy Amon smiled leisurely.
You can use paper figurines to replace you, but so can paper figurines replace you. It being parasitized is equivalent to you being parasitized. Everything is relative, and all of them have loopholes. No beyonder power is uncrackable. They can be used in any suitable situation.
He made use of the relationship of the paper figurine substitute and the main body to create a bug. Although Amon looked like he was unable to control his desire to speak due to his madness, it didn't stop him from corroding Klein with his full strength. He strengthened the parasitizing bit by bit, making Klein truly wear a monocle and become him. At that moment, Klein's body suddenly collapsed. He had taken the initiative to do so. He split into countless transparent maggots that swam in all directions. Among these worms of spirit, there were a few worms of time with 12 segments mixed in. Strictly speaking, Amon's worms of time could forcefully parasitize very tiny creatures, like the worms of spirit. However, when Klein split up, he took the initiative to use his fooling authority to confuse the order of time. He fooled the few worms of time, making them split up only towards the end. Unable to find the cluster of worms of spirit, they lost their target for parasitizing. In the next second, the scene in Saphira Castle changed again. Klein once again used the realm of mystery's powers to create a new divine kingdom for the fool. Amon instantly entered a room. This place was covered with a thick yellow carpet with a crystal chandelier hanging from it. There was a door on each wall, and it was unknown where they led to. At the same time, there were oil paintings depicting various eyes hanging from the four walls. Hu Minmerix Afeada. There was no need for any special scrutiny. With just a glance, Amon knew that the four doors corresponded to different effects. The main purpose was to delay his actions and create enough time for Klein to make subsequent preparations. The corners of Mr. Error curled up slightly as he cast his gaze to the ground. He extended his right fist and stretched out his fingers. An illusory door appeared on the thick yellow carpet. The door quickly moved for 1 second before it became fixed in place and silently opened. However, with the opening of the illusory door, the doors around the room began to move strangely. The doors creaked and opened. Almost at the same time, in the pitch-black wilderness, in a dark tower that led to the sky, Klein was holding the magic wishing lamp and removing the effects of fooling on the Trunsoist brass book. The candlewick of the magic wishing lamp lit up as it spewed out a sticky, pale gold glow. These rays of light transformed into a distorted, blurry figure. Klein didn't consider making a wish with the genie to transfer Bernadette's wishes onto him and change the ownership of the magic wishing lamp. This was because there would only be one outcome. He would die on the spot and return from the fog of history with the miracle invoker's powers. Normally, this was a good way to escape, especially since Klein could revive several times. However, the situation this time was completely different from before. Once Klein died, it would mean that he had temporarily given up on his identity as the owner of Saphira Castle, making this place a paradise for Amon. he could use this sapphire without any obstruction. Under such circumstances, Aemon could completely fool history, interfere with fate, and suppress Klein's resurrection, making him truly die. The ones who were most effective against a Beyonder were definitely higher sequence Beyonders of the same pathway. Therefore, Klein's current plan was to use the status of the genie to better use the Trunsoist brass book. If the genie didn't exert a certain influence, the rules set by the Trunsoist brass book definitely wouldn't be biased towards Klein. It would only restrict all existences other than itself. As the genie's blurry, pale gold figure took form, the Trunsoist brass book produced the sound of colliding metal and quickly flipped to the second half of the book that allowed writing. Without any gap in time, new text appeared on the brass page. Theft is prohibited here. If Klein had the choice, the most suitable rule would be acts of theft are prohibited here because the former clause was a law. It couldn't stop someone from committing theft ahead of time, and it could only deliver punishment after the act. Furthermore, punishment for first-time thieves was inevitably light, something the Ammons could withstand. His idea restricted the possibility of such actions. There was no such thing as theft. However, there was no way for the Trunsoist brass book to make such a rule right now. One had to wait until the provisions were watertight enough, and that it had awakened to a certain extent before that was possible. Previously, the genie had relied on his close connection with the Trunsoist brass book, his high status, and all his strength before he could enforce similar rules. At this moment, he was already drained and unable to do such things. At present, all Klein could do was try his best to stall for time so that the Trunsoist brass book could produce a sufficiently strict setup of laws to target Aemon, so as to act in concert with his fooling authority. At this moment, in the room that trapped Aemon, as the illusory door on the ground opened, the 4 real doors shook and cracks appeared. This would bring about many unknown effects. Suddenly, the sound of a bell rang out from an endless distance away. At some point in time, Aemon had transformed into an ancient, mottled stone wall clock. On the wall clock, the second hand formed by the worm of time suddenly paused. Gong! As the bell reverberated, everything in the room froze strangely, including the 4 doors. The only exception was Aemon. He had transformed back to his pointy-hatted, classic, black-robed look. With a smile, he calmly raised his left hand and tightened his 5 fingers. In the next second, the strange, frozen state was broken. The 4 doors that were about to open had closed again with a bang, leaving no gaps behind. Aemon's figure descended and burrowed into the illusory door that wasn't closed. Just as he used this method to leave the room, he discovered that he had arrived in a pitch-black wilderness. There was a dark tower that seemed to pierce the sky in the distance. Inside the tower, the Trunsoist brass book in front of Klein had formed a second rule. Deception is prohibited here. Although Aemon couldn't see what was happening, it was as though he had sensed something. After all, a high-ranking person who used the rules of deception as entertainment was undoubtedly able to sense the changes in the rules. Otherwise, there was no way of accurately finding loopholes. He immediately raised his hand and adjusted the monocle stuck in his right eye. On the surface of the crystal monocle, a blinding, pure white light spewed out, illuminating the wilderness. There were no longer any concealed existences here. This was the eternal daytime that he had previously given to Klein and retrieved from Klein's main body. In such an environment, the dark tower melted inch by inch. Klein floated in midair, with one hand holding the magic wishing lamp and the other holding the staff of the stars. In front of him was the open Trunsoist brass book. Aemon took the opportunity to stretch out his hand that was holding onto the monocle. From a distance, he gripped Klein's projection to his palm. Behind him, the shadow that had been dragged out by the eternal daytime seemed to become fainter as it twisted with vitality. Without a sound, Aemon began stealing Klein's various Beyonder powers. He didn't deliberately seek out the fooling authority. Instead, he chose to be random to increase the success rate. However, With a flash of light, what fell into his palm was only a simple paper figurine. Grafting. Pa! The shadow behind Eamon's back was lashed by an invisible whip, and he was completely unharmed. He created an error, letting his shadow replace him. Following that, Eamon laughed as his voice resonated in Klein's ears.
Genie, I can also promise to send you back to the cosmos. Look, I wasn't punished. This means that I'm not swindling you.
Chapter 1384. Conceptualization. Upon hearing Eamon's words, Klein's heart sank. Before this, he wasn't worried that Eamon would collude with Genie, because he was a top-notch swindler. No promises he made could be believed. As for Genie, he had encountered the former Lord of the Mysteries. He was considered a victim of such matters in a similar vein. Therefore, he would definitely use his most wary of approaches to deal with Mr. Error. This was the result of a lack of trust. Sometimes lying, cheating, and swindling could indeed increase the profits in the short term, but in the long term it was better to be honest. But now, the Trunsoist Brass book had just formulated the rule of deception is prohibited here, and Eamon didn't receive any punishment after making the promise. At the same time, Klein and Genie didn't notice him using any loopholes. This proved how true and effective Eamon's words were. It was from the bottom of his heart and wasn't a scam. Genie could even rely on his own level and traits to distort the sentence from "I can promise" to "I promise." It would make it impossible for Eamon to go back on his word. If he did, he would suffer damage at the level of a great old one. This made Klein not help but wonder if the rule that deception is prohibited here was secretly guided by Eamon or deliberately created by Genie, making any Lord of the Mysteries candidate to promise to return him to the cosmos. To Genie, he didn't suffer any losses in such a deal because Klein himself owed him a promise. If it were any other scene, Klein would still have the time to communicate with Genie and rebuild his trust. However, at this moment, Eamon's threat was right before his eyes. He wouldn't give him the chance to resolve this problem. If he chose to continue to believe in Genie, Klein would be putting his life in the hands of this outer deity and be under his control. In the subsequent battle, as long as Genie was able to formulate a few rules that appeared to be fine but were biased towards Eamon through the Trunsoist Brass book, Klein, who was already at a great disadvantage, would rapidly lose with no way to reverse the situation. As his thoughts raced, Klein made the choice of this gamble. A translucent, dark-colored cloak instantly appeared around him. His face was covered with a strange and distorted mask. The fool! Invisible rings rippled from his body and instantly enveloped Genie, the Trunsoist Brass book, and the entire wilderness, as well as Eamon. Blind stupidity authority. Eamon's monocle temporarily lost its luster, as though he had lost his vision. His gaze also turned dull. The speed of text being written on the Trunsoist Brass book clearly slowed down, as though it would take 15 minutes or even hours to think up the next rule. Genie's blurry and distorted golden figure shook as it suddenly shrank back into the golden magic lamp that looked like a water flask. It was unknown if it was escaping or if it was purely an instinctual reaction. Seizing this opportunity, Klein attempted to escape Sapphira Castle as he prepared to graft something to himself. Just as his consciousness sank, the crystal monocle appeared at the edge of Sapphira Castle, blocking his path. Even though his intelligence had been reduced briefly, Eamon still seemed to remember to stop Klein from leaving Sapphira Castle. His eyes quickly regained clarity as they were still dyed black. His mouth slowly opened as he laughed uncontrollably.
I've written this matter into my instinct. This is a good way to resist the effects of blind stupidity.
Clearly, he had cheated the rules and lied to himself, making his instincts believe that this was what he wanted. Klein wasn't depressed. He immediately completed the grafting he had prepared long ago. In the cosmos, a giant star that emitted light and heat suddenly dimmed. In the wilderness, with the effects of eternal daylight, an orange sun with a destructive aura and a heavy feeling descended from the sky. The entire wilderness collapsed and curled up as though it was going to charge straight into the star. At the same time, everything here was ignited, including Eamon. In the next second, the surrounding void began to shrink as they revolved around the real sun. Everything in the world either disintegrated or vaporized. All that was left was the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist Brass book, which were still struggling to withstand the flames, barely suffering any damage. Klein, who was floating in midair, had long disappeared. He had grafted himself to that star. Of course, his grafting was only with the concept of a star, not a physical entity. Otherwise, with the Fool's obviously lower defense than most sequence zeros, he would be directly swallowed by a real star and die on the spot, thanks to his relatively weak body. The Fool was a very extreme deity. He had the ability to destroy a star, but he was unable to face it directly. His strengths and weaknesses were equally obvious. In addition, conceptualized objects couldn't directly affect the surrounding environment and harm the enemy. It wasn't enough to write the words immense mass, gravity, high temperatures, high heat, and fusion to create similar effects, but as Mr. Fool, Klein held the authority of fooling. He made his surroundings change according to the concept of a star. This was an intense change and also a type of fooling. Eamon, who was wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, was completely ignited under the illumination of the star. He began to vaporize. At this moment, his figure distorted as he was instantly dyed with resplendent starlight. He turned extremely illusory, as though he had transformed into an astral door. At that moment, Eamon no longer resembled a physical creature. He was closer to a collective body of the symbols like wandering, astral world, tunnel, key, and door. This was the ability of a planeswalker to use the astral world to head to different planets and worlds. They were able to transform themselves into symbols, allowing them to effectively use the astral world. At Sequence Zero Door's stage, the qualitative change in such powers became conceptualized. Eamon transformed himself into a concept creature and avoided the damage brought by the star. A figure suddenly appeared behind him. It was Klein, who was wearing a trench coat and a top hat. Almost at the same time, Eamon's thoughts slowed down a little. His spirit body threads were grabbed by Klein. Using the chaos brought by the star, Klein dispelled the combination he had with the corresponding concepts, and he secretly grafted the location of both parties and arrived behind Eamon. Originally, without the concept of reassembly, the star's influence on the surroundings would immediately stop. However, Klein had fooled time, allowing the effects of the first 2 seconds to linger until now, allowing him to fool Amon. If possible, what Klein wished to do now was to deepen the control of Eamon's spirit-body threads and turn him into his marionette. However, he knew very well that in the present situation the probability of success was very low. On the one hand, Eamon could withstand damage and steal the spirit-body threads back. On the other hand, he might be able to use the connection established between the two of them via the spirit-body threads to use a bug and influence Klein and parasitize him. Before he had absolute confidence, Klein didn't want his actions to appear rash. The main goal of capturing Eamon's spirit-body threads was to give the other party a certain sense of sluggishness. This was a performance of the fooling authority during the stage of transforming into a marionette. And with Klein's present state, he was naturally more willing to choose such a low-level but effective method. This would be less of a burden on him, and it wouldn't seriously affect his mental stability like when he used the authority of fooling. At this moment, apart from Eamon, his enemy also included the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body. Of course, Eamon was the same. If he didn't suppress the celestial worthy's madness, the latter would have already revived in his body. After creating a brief pause in Eamon's thoughts, Klein had 3 choices. The first was to take this opportunity to escape Sapphira Castle. But he wasn't sure if Eamon's instincts were still working, and would still attempt to stop him from escaping. Second, it was to summon the projections of the historical void, but it wasn't of much use. The effects of an angel-level existence could do little in this battle of gods. It was possible that they couldn't withstand Eamon's gaze, much less their historical projections. Even if Klein wanted to use it to transmit information, it lacked sufficient value. The other deities couldn't enter Sapphira Castle and provide help. Third, he could use this opportunity to exert a certain amount of influence on Eamon's true body. Without any hesitation, Klein chose the third plan. He wanted to take the opportunity to graft Eamon, Sapphira Castle, and the door of light that was stained with bluish-black together. Klein felt that Eamon's half-crazy state wasn't bad enough. He just appeared rather talkative, with him occasionally not grasping an opportunity. He wanted to make him go crazier. When Aemon and Sapphira Castle completed the reassembly, the celestial worthy's will in his body would clearly strengthen, and the chaos in his mind would intensify. That way, Aemon would lack the rationality to restrain himself, making his actions more instinctive than being the result of a contemplative thinking process. To Mr. Error, who was an expert at deceit, this would be fatal. Of course, Klein could only maintain this kind of grafting for a second. Exceeding this limit might mean that he would no longer be facing Aemon, but the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When the time came, the other party would definitely gladly accept the gift of Sapphira Castle. He could then fight Sequence 0 the Fool with a Sapphira, 2 uniquenesses, and the corresponding Sequence 1 beyond her characteristics. Originally, Klein could have relied on his fooling authority to reduce Aemon's intelligence, but firstly, he wasn't able to use power at this level for a long time in his current state. Secondly, as a dual-pathway true god, and a wielder of many authorities, the duration of the blind stupidity effect on him was rather limited. Therefore, Klein had no choice but to take the risk of grafting things in such a way, and madness would accompany Aemon, doing so until he found a new balance or met the best psychiatrist. In the blink of an eye, the translucent, cold mask appeared on Klein's face once again. A strange door of light that was stained with a hint of bluish-black suffused from Aemon's body. Sapphira Castle. Chapter 1385. Madness. Aemon and the strange door of light were grafted together. His face grimaced as the darkness in his eyes intensified. At the same time, more slippery tentacles appeared under his classic black robe. Fully showcasing the crazy feeling was completely displayed. Just as Klein was preparing to sever the connection between Aemon and Sapphira Castle and make him maintain his madness, the corners of Aemon's mouth curled up. It was as if he was saying,
Congratulations, you have fallen into a trap.
His face was immediately covered with a translucent mask that was similar to the Fool's uniqueness, but one that was even more illusory. Klein's mind tensed up, and without a second thought, he immediately used the authority of fooling without any regard for the consequences. But before he could react, his thoughts slowed down. He was in a dazed state that he didn't know what to do. Fooling. Aemon actually used the temporary reassembly between him and Sapphira Castle to escape Klein's interference and activate the power of the Fool's domain. Such an action completely exceeded his instincts and was more like a meticulous trap. Aemon didn't seem to be crazy enough. This true god of the error and door pathways immediately removed the grafting of himself to Sapphira Castle, allowing the mysterious door that was tainted with hints of bluish-black to quickly fade away to prevent him from being tainted further. After dealing with this latent danger, Aemon raised both hands, his thumbs and index fingers touching each other to form an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, perfectly embracing Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Aemon's hand suddenly parted to the side, as though they were tearing something apart. This seemed to be a heavy task. With the tearing sounds of paper, the area where Klein's body was in seemed to turn into glass. Under the intense impact, countless cracks appeared as they shattered bit by bit. This was a form of regression and the destruction of space. Unable to withstand it at all, Klein's body could only turn into paper fragments that flew in the air as the surrounding void collapsed and shattered. These bits of paper were instantly swallowed up by the darkness. By the time the space collapsed, Klein's paper figurines were almost exhausted. Of course, he also relied on the level and traits of the Fool to forcefully escape the effects of blind stupidity. And at this moment, Aemon had already split into countless figures. Some of them were purely avatars, some were replicas on the level of symbolism, while others were left behind from constantly blinking. At that moment, the sky above Klein's head and the surrounding wilderness were occupied by Aemon's. They wore pointed hats and monocles, blocking every single loophole. Some of these Aemons transformed into old, mottled, bluish-black wall clocks. Some of them turned into pure starlight, as though they were trying to create a cage. Some extended their hands, doing different levels of theft. Some of the monocles glowed as they used various items that they had stolen from the past. Some simulated various abilities, either exerting limitations, interference, or attacks. In the Marauder pathway, theft was a core skill, one of its main symbols. The difference between it and a seer's control of spirit-body threads was that, as one advanced through the sequences, not only did its effects and success rate increase, it also obtained a deeper level of conceptualization. At sequence 9 to sequence 7, theft happened on items. At sequence 6, theft happened on beyonder powers. After advancing to sequence 5, theft happened on thoughts and ideas. At sequence 4 and sequence 3, theft became life, including parasitic theft at the physical level. And at sequence 2 level, the range of theft broadened to fate, identity, self-awareness, and beyonder characteristics. As for sequence 1, theft could temporarily happen on time, anchors, and authorities. Therefore, when an error faced a true deity, he could also use theft that had reached the level of authority. With a gong, the ancient wall clocks paused in unison. This caused the surrounding environment to freeze, causing the destroyed wilderness from the sun's blast to become extremely quiet. Even the destruction was frozen. At that moment, Klein seemed to lose his body. All that was left was a translucent, dark-colored cloak and a bizarre, ice-cold mask. Under the cloak and mask was rich darkness. Nothing could be seen other than the slippery and sinister tentacles that extended out. In such a state, Klein seemed to escape the limitations of time. In a frozen environment, he moved like a fish. Through various cracks in reality or concept, he emerged from the encirclement of the Amons. He once again used his fooling authority. This time, he fooled time. The ancient wall clocks vanished, and in the desolate wilderness that had almost completely collapsed, time returned to its normal flow. The Amons stopped their attempts, suddenly merged into one, and blinked behind Klein, preventing him from having a breather. His left palm reached out, and as he retracted it, he clenched his fingers. Around Klein, the space suddenly became shrouded in shadows, making it look like a thin fishnet veil. The fishnet veil began to twist and reassemble, as though they formed a sufficiently strong cage that trapped Klein inside. An illusory door appeared above the cage as it moved quickly without being fixed in place. However, Klein's figure suddenly appeared outside the cell, as though he had never been sealed by Amon's door authority. He had fooled history and had split his previous and future self. Hence, the one imprisoned in the cell became his historical projection. This was the scholar of Yor's powers deepening under the fooling authority. As he had relied on an advancement ritual based on fooling history, Klein's the fool powers in such a domain were stronger than when he fooled time and fate. As soon as he escaped the spatial cell, Klein immediately used the realm of mysteries to create a new divine kingdom of the fool. This was to stall for time and find a chance to stabilize his mental state. He had used the fooling authority multiple times, and the weak balance in his body was on the verge of collapsing. If he didn't stabilize his mental state as soon as possible, the will of the celestial worthy would awaken further. This was also a serious problem. At this moment, a huge crystal monocle appeared in front of him. On this monocle, layers of sparkling light surged out and flooded him instantly. Ass. Klein's mental state suddenly stabilized, but the price was to lose all his emotions and desires. He didn't even want to resist. All he wanted was to stand there quietly and wait for the impending destruction. This was like an ordinary person being injected with a huge dose of anesthetic. At the same time, an illusory book appeared in the layers of light. The book opened, revealing a sentence. Tormented by the Lord of the Mysteries' mental corruption, Klein Moretti had always been in great pain and a state of extreme exhaustion. After the intense battle, he has finally reached his limits. Due to the influence of his mind, he had decided to give up and stop resisting. Wenu. Behind the huge crystal monocle, Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat and classic black robe, quickly outlined himself like a mountain. He looked at Klein, who had given up resisting, and his dark eyes turned lighter as the corners of his lips curled up.
I stole it. How is it?
Klein raised his head to look at Mr. Eyre, and he tried hard to open his mouth. He said weakly,
You were pulling off a deception from the beginning?
Eamon raised his hands and said with a smile.
Unfortunately, you realized it too late.
He made his thumbs and index fingers touch each other, forming an oval. In the oval, starlight lit up, illuminating Klein's figure. Right on the heels of that, Eamon solemnly separated his hands, tearing apart the void where Klein and the surrounding environment relied on to live. The void was like glass, shattering into pieces like the collapse of a skyscraper. However, all the collapsing and destruction circled Klein's body without directly affecting him. He was like a small fishing boat that calmly cruised through a storm. It appeared out of place and disharmonious, as though it didn't seem to belong here. Eamon raised his hand and adjusted his monocle on his right eye. The smile on his face somewhat faded. A translucent cloak kept popping up and disappearing over the surface of Klein's body. He looked at the mountain like Eamon, his eyes turning darker.
From the moment you entered Sapphira Castle and said the first word, you began your deceit.
At that time, Eamon said that he had taken the risk to release the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries in his body, in exchange for the identity of Sapphira Castle's owner. At that moment, Eamon didn't take the opportunity to continue attacking Klein. He floated in midair and looked down at Mr. Fool. Klein didn't make any attempts either. His tone was strangely calm, as though he was preparing something.
If simply releasing the suppression of the Lord of the Mysteries will allows you to enter Sapphira Castle at the cost of being half crazy, Antigonus could have done so back then. The Annihilation demonic wolf, Phlegrea, from even earlier could have done it as well. You and Mr. Dorr previously had countless opportunities. Clearly, it's impossible to invade Sapphira Castle by just making the Lord of the Mysteries awaken to a certain extent, and using half-craziness in concert with error. There's no way you can find a usable bug in this matter unless you directly get him to replace you. Only when you possess the door authority to go anywhere did you see hope. By creating a back door and using bugs, you could make Sapphira Castle treat you as the Lord of the Mysteries and give you the corresponding authority. Of course, this will definitely require the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries to a rather dangerous state. Without this hidden identity, you won't be able to deceive Sapphira Castle without any reason. After absorbing Door's uniqueness, you didn't immediately infiltrate Sapphira Castle to deal with me, who was even weaker back then. It was because at that time, you were unable to completely withstand the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries as well, with you having just advanced. I believe you've already found a relatively safer solution. If I hadn't advanced to the Fool so quickly, you would have been able to enter Sapphira Castle in the best state to resolve everything sometime later. And now, you have no choice but to bring this plan forward. There's definitely a very serious problem with you. You took the initiative to throw out the price of becoming half crazy to, on the one hand, make me think of countermeasures in this direction so as to lay a deadly trap in key areas, and on the other hand, you also wanted to divert attention and use this opportunity to conceal other problems. You're not half mad at all.
Eamon quietly listened to Klein's words. Rather abnormally, he didn't interrupt him, nor did he attempt to attack. Only when Klein was done did he say with an odd expression,
You're crazy.